Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on Webinar Wednesday. Today, our session is entitled Out of Control. So it's a look at the limitations of the planning and building regulations, what you can and can't do, and what you need the regulations for, and in effect, what you don't. My name is Katie. I look after the digital side here at CABE, and I'll be here online to answer any questions that you may have throughout this morning and hopefully address anything that crops up along the way. To get in touch with us, there's a panel on the right-hand side of your screen of which you can send in questions, so feel free to type them in. And what we'll do is, as we go along, we'll do our best to answer them within the session itself, or ultimately we'll answer them at the end. If we find that we're getting a lot of questions on certain topics, we can compile a frequently asked questions document that we can publish after the event. Alternatively, if it's quite a specific question or comment, we can actually come back to you individually and look at the concerns that you're raising. On Twitter, if you want to use the hashtag CABECPD, feel free. And your presenter today, it's Kevin Blunden, Deputy CEO here at CABE, and he looks after all technical matters. And so I shall hand you over.
Good morning. Hopefully everything's working perfectly all right this morning. Welcome to this webinar, which is the last of our academic year of 2016. We will be taking a short break following this one and then see where we go in the future. Right, today we're looking at planning and building regulations and the limitation of those pieces of legislation in terms of what is outside of control doesn't have to go through any form of framework. In other words, in plain terms, what can the Englishman, Welshman do to their property without having to seek permission from an authority? And I think it's important to make the clear point at this stage that even if something doesn't require planning permission or building regulation approval, there may be other steps that people have to go through in carrying out work, whether that's dealing with their neighbours under a party wall notification, whether it's talking to financial institutions, and there may be other permissions that might be needed in terms of approvals. There are also a number of cases where the normal allowances under the planning system may not apply to a particular property because of its particular designation or location. And therefore, in every instance, it's important before carrying out any development to talk to the planning authority to establish what the particular conditions are for that property. So we're going to look at planning and building regulations. And for most of us working in the industry as professionals, it's fine, we sort of know the difference between the two. Planning is very much about the development, control of development, the management of land, the appearance of development, making sure that things are in keeping with their environment, fit into overall plans for the development of an area. Whereas the building regulations are very much the technical nuts and bolts, the rules of how we make buildings safe, accessible, sustainable. Now there have been an increase over recent years in the amount of technical aspects that have been covered under planning conditions and planning advice, and in the last 12-18 months we've seen a tendency to restrict the overlap between planning and building regulations so that we are looking at a single level of control. And the housing standards review that went on and the subsequent changes to planning and building regulations have seen a situation where we are placing most of our technical requirements within building regulations and reducing any overlapping or conflicting requirements that exist within the planning framework. That said, we are also seeing a much closer link-up between planning and building regulations, and the best example of those are the optional building regulations that were introduced, where the planning team will determine what standard is required in terms of technical performance, and that will dictate which building regulation standard then applies through the building control process. So we are looking at a more joined up sort of development. So I'm going to start off looking a bit more at the planning side of things and fitted development. So these are the bits that can be done without resort to a planning application. Now, some permitted development that we're allowing for properties at the moment has been set down as being permitted, not needing full planning permission, for a temporary period. And those of you who watched how the planning system was developed will have seen that we had a temporary easing of permitted development, and that temporary easing has been renewed now until 2019. So theoretically, some development is allowed between now and 2019. It is possible that after that date it will come back under control for anything of a similar nature in the future, although having been exempted out for a while, it perhaps is a little bit more unlikely that that will happen. When you're advising clients, when you're looking for information yourself, it is important that you look at the correct bit of legislation. There are some guides, if you Google the internet, that are talking about older conditions. The current principles are enshrined in the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development England Order 2015, which details what can and can't be done, what, if you like, has been given blanket approval. And it is worth reading that in quite some detail, because there are some nuances in some of the work that can be carried out. Certainly what follows in the slides that I'll be talking about this morning is very much a summarised version of that, and I would suggest you read the correct document. And alongside that order there is actually a technical guide to try and give a little bit more information about perhaps what it actually means. So it does mean that generally a lot of work doesn't need permission from a local authority, but it may well be that if work is being carried out within a designated area, then that might still need a permission. And in addition, what's normally permitted throughout the country may actually be restricted on a local development if planning have used an Article 4 direction, which basically takes away the permitted development rights to make sure the character of an area can be maintained going forward. So if we look at some of the sorts of things that people can do without permission, and I'm tending to focus in the first instance on the domestic stuff. Obviously, the main issue when somebody's looking at putting an addition or an improvement or alteration to their property is that although it may be permitted, we're still looking to try and maintain a level of local amenity and a level of protection of the environment. So the rules that determine whether or not you can do something will still have some blanket elements to them that will be aiming to achieve that level of protection. So certainly we're looking at something that once we've enlarged, once we put an extension onto the property, we're not taking up more than 50% of the footprint of the curtilage of the property. We're not looking to take any new extension or alteration higher than the ridge of the existing roof. The eaves shouldn't be any higher than the existing eaves. And when we've got an elevation, be it a front elevation or a side elevation that's facing onto a highway, we shouldn't extend upon the front of that, or as we would perhaps have called it in traditional terms, beyond the building line, although that's not a term that's used in the order anymore. And then there are some additional requirements in terms of the amount that the extension can exceed. So can't exceed too far to the rear or too far to the side, and those are the bits that vary depending on the order that gives us more time up until 2019 for a slightly relaxed standards. And then a general overall issue about extensions and heights of extensions. So when somebody's planning domestic work, there's a whole range of things that they have to tick the boxes to show that they don't have to go through the planning system. Now, planning authorities will look at applications to determine whether it's permitted development or not, but in doing so they may well look for a degree of a simplistic application or charge a fee for looking at that service. One of the big problems that you'll come across when talking to your clients or trying to come to a sensible approach of how to deal with some of these issues are the issues that the requirements for permitted development that doesn't need to go through the planning process are different than the requirements for exemption from building regulations. And quite often the client and the designer and people advising will get those things muddled and will assume that if it doesn't need planning permission, it won't need building regulations. And that isn't the case. So obviously, even if something meets a Class A permitted development requirement, it may still require building regulations. whilst we're looking at these Class A, the bulk of where the domestic stuff might be, there are some other conditions in terms of what we can and can't do. So in terms of the extension and how much it extends and how close it goes to the back fence. And then we have to look at where the boundary is, where the eaves are, how we extend. And a lot of this is to do with overlooking the neighbours. If you've got a large rear extension, there's a potential you're going to overlook your neighbours to the back. Similarly, if you're putting a balcony or something of that sort, it's to do with that issue. So it's trying to deal with some of the main problems that might occur if we go through and try and pick up some of the issues. Just to pick up on an early question before I go too far, and I'll just drop back to the slide before, the two bits in orange here, in terms of the extensions at the back, the larger provision is the one that's currently allowed under this sort of temporary permitted development until 2019, whereas the other one is the base requirement. That's why they appear to be of differing standards. It's because one is what applies at the moment, the other is the base requirement. Okay. So these are our general provisions, and as I say, these are the things that you're allowed to do without permission in most parts of the country, but you're not allowed to do it in a designated area, which would be something like an area of standing natural beauty or a designated national park or something of that sort. And again, if you're in a conservation area or a listed building, you won't have these permitted development rights, so you will have to still go through an application process. It gets a little bit more onerous when we start looking at particularly alterations to the roof, which generally involve things like rooms in the roof, dormer windows, things of that sort. So again, there are restrictions in terms of doing that. Obviously, what we're looking again is to protect the character, so really large dormers that end up being a large box across the full width of the back, and one of the things we're trying to look at. So when we look at whether we can do that or not, we're looking to see whether we've got a pitched roof. Is the pitched roof similar to what we've got? Are we not raising the height of it? Are we not extending upon the roof plane, so we're not actually making it extend so that it just ends up an extension of the external wall rather than an alteration of the roof? How much are we actually increasing the content within inside the property? And again, we've got slight differences there depending on whether it's a terraced property or a detached property, because obviously that will have a knock-on effect on the general appearance of the street scene. We're also looking at the eaves line being maintained so that we have at least a gap and the face of the door is set back so that it doesn't carry on that rear plane of the building all the way on up. And again, in terms of things like windows, Juliet balconies, verandas, there's this issue of trying to make sure that we don't overlook our neighbours' properties. Most of the complaints that tend to come about as a result of these works are about overlooking either into the back of a property that backs onto us, or overlooking gardens or things of that sort. And with all of these, there's a sort of a bolt-on that ideally we want to be doing it in similar materials to the existing so that it doesn't stick out a bit like a sore thumb. Other things that we might be doing to the roof, this could be things like chimneys, flues. There are separate requirements that deal with things like installation of solar panels. So again, there are controls on those, but slightly different rules. But if we're doing an alteration to the roof, if it doesn't extend more than 150 mil, doesn't go beyond the highest part, or if it is something like a roof light, again, if it's glazing, then we have to make sure we've got obscure glazing up to 1.7 so that we're not overlooking anybody else round and about. So it is all about protecting that amenity. One of the even slightly more confusing and out of step elements with permitted development is when it comes to a simple little ground floor extension, something like a porch. Now, a porch is dealt with separately than the Class A extension alteration type arrangement, because to a certain extent a little porch is allowed to sit on the front of the building beyond that existing building line. So that's a subtle difference and why it's dealt with differently. One of the areas of confusion is that porches are exempt under planning as permitted development, but porches have a different requirement for exemption under building regulations, and the two don't necessarily mean that one satisfies the other criteria. So with a little porch going on the front of the building or the side of the building that's fronting to a highway, it can't be more than 3 meters high, it's got to be 2 meters from a boundary or to a highway, and the floor area mustn't exceed 3 square meters. So these are intended to be very small little weather porches to go onto the front of buildings for a little bit of weather protection. Other bits and pieces, things that we can put into the building that we don't have to worry about, things like ancillary buildings and the like. Again, if we're putting something in the back garden, something like a shed or an ancillary type building or a swimming pool enclosure, we've got to look at the area of the property that's being developed, and that's particularly challenging on a lot of developments where properties have been built in the last 10, 20 years, where developments in their initial development have squeezed a lot of properties onto a site, when we've been looking at sort of building, 14 to the hectare or something of that sort, and as a result you can end up with the original property taking up a high percentage of the actual curtilage of the property, in which case there's very little scope to do much else. But as long as we keep these buildings single story, not going beyond the front elevation, and relatively small within dimensional constraints, again they're the sort of thing that can be used, can be built without neighbours particularly having a say in whether they want it, whether the ability to object under a planning application, and without any form of strict control over how that's done. So if we look now at how some of the similar sort of things and similar sorts of buildings and exemptions work under the building regulations, there are a number of bits of the building regulations that do not apply to certain types of buildings. Now, some types of buildings are mentioned in the set part of the building regulations that deal with exemptions, but some are also exempted from possibly the procedural requirements if they are dealt with in another way. So crown properties and the like won't go through the normal process of building regulations, although most buildings will still try to achieve a level of compliance with the regulatory framework. So the first class of exemption for building regulations is really around buildings that are dealt with in terms of other legislation, where in essence the building regulations aren't the appropriate tool to be using to determine the level of performance in terms of safety of these buildings. So where we're looking at manufacture and storage of explosives, where we're looking at nuclear installations, they're covered by other legislation, so therefore the building regulations don't cover those. And if it is a listed monument, an ancient monument or an archaeological area, again that's not particularly covered under building regulations because it wouldn't be appropriate. So theoretically, I'm sure you've all seen the advert on the TV, if Lawrence Llewellyn-Bowen actually gets his way with redecorating Stonehenge, he won't require a building regulation application. So other sorts of buildings that the building regulations won't actually deal with, because building regulations are about health and safety of people in and about buildings. If the building is one that people don't actually go into, then it may well be that it's not required to comply with the building regulations. Now there will be buildings that maybe people just go into occasionally to inspect a bit of maintained fixed plant or machinery, and traditionally it was thought that these were sort of plant and service buildings, but in reality now the question mark is being raised about what about a storage building or an industrial building where everything within the property is automated, and the exemption is not really intended to catch that as well. Having said that we're not dealing with the building because people don't go into it, we are then looking at the effect of people around the building. So there are some requirements even on detached buildings about how close they are to the boundary and to other buildings, so that actually should they catch fire they don't have an adverse effect on other people round and about. Okay. Other types of building that are exempt, agriculture and greenhouses are generally exempt. Again, there are some issues in terms of setting fire to other buildings, so we have to look at how far the building is from a boundary. We also have to make sure it is generally agriculture and a greenhouse and there's no sleeping accommodation within it, and a general basic level of means of escape so that we've got an exit we can get to from 30 metres within the building. When we're looking at agriculture or horticulture, it is purely in terms of the activity, and if we end up with something that does agriculture or horticulture but is also a packaging plant or is open to the public for retail sale, then that no longer meets the requirements for exemption from the regulations. Right, I'm just going to try and pick up on a couple of questions that popped in because I don't want to go too far beyond where people have asked the questions. So just flicking back through, right. Somebody's asked under the planning rules, where it says there's a requirement to use similar materials, to what extent is this enforced? For example, tile types. If the original roof had a plain tile and it's now being used as an interlocking one. Planning authorities will tend to look at whether to take enforcement, and it is enforceable if the materials aren't similar. What their main criteria will be whether it blends into the appearance of the property, whether there's a noticeable difference, and how much that's been mitigated in the work. So if it doesn't look similar, if there is going to be a problem and you know as a designer you can't match the materials going into the project, even though it may be permitted development, I would suggest at that early design stage you talk to the planning authority about what the correct solution might be in terms of the roof material. Okay. Now it is a bit of an odd situation because we're all aware that an awful lot of properties get re-roofed which don't necessarily go through a framework and end up with a totally dissimilar material ending up on there. But if you can't manage to get something that's going to look fairly similar to the original, then of course talk to the planning authority. There's also the issue that when you're doing something and trying to get it to match, if the original material is 30, 40, 50 years old, even if you can get exactly the same material, because of weathering, exposure to the environment, it's not going to look exactly the same at day one. Somebody's asked a question about railway buildings and exempt from building regulations. Again, it's one of these issues. It depends how it's set up, how it's operated, which company's doing it, whether we're talking about the rail network or a provider. There are some of these buildings that are exempted out from the process but still technically should comply. And what we're generally seeing as a trend is even where people are exempted out of the process now, because of the potential ramifications if anything go wrong, they either look as a body to set up their own process to deal with building regulations and building control so that somebody does a check and an assessment, or they will look to use a building control body to give them that advice. In terms of planning, there are still requirements to go through planning processes for these sorts of buildings where they're not permitted development. Somebody's asking, is there any difference between council-owned properties and privately owned properties? And the answer to that one is no, there is no difference at all. The legislation applies evenly across those. Okay, there's another question there about building regs exemption of buildings on rail track land. And as I say, the general issue is that if it's something to do with the function of the railway, it may well be exempt from the procedure requirements but still have to meet the technical requirements of building regulations. If it's something else, if it's the cafe, if it's the car park, if it's anything to do with anything else that's there, then no, it's not. Okay, somebody's asked a question about, are prisons covered by other legislation? Prisons have separate guidance in terms of parts of the legislation. So approved document B of the building regulations, which deal with means of escape, specifically say that it doesn't apply to prisons. as you know, I suppose the basic principle is we don't want to design in a means of escape from a prison, but at the same time the Department of Justice issued guidance on how to deal with means of escape. So they're not totally exempted out of the property because they are prisons. Again, they don't have to go through building regulation process, but they do have to comply. So they'll be dealt with as a separate issue. Okay. Are there limitations on what a Crown body could claim exemption from? Could they build holiday accommodation as a Crown property as part of a forestry commission? I would argue no. If it's Crown, it's got to be something to do with the activity. Holiday accommodation isn't actually part of what they're dealing with. But again, I suppose it could be debated. Even with the exemption, there's still a need to comply, though. Right, that's picked up a few questions. I'm now going to try and just carry on and pick up a few slides, and I'll come back to the questions again in a moment. Right, temporary buildings. Any building that's not intended to remain where it's erected for more than 28 days. That's a straightforward issue. It's supposed to do with semi-temporary accommodation. Again, with all legislation, there will be some nuances within the wording. Not intended to remain where it is for more than 28 days. At what point does it then become an issue if it is there more than 28 days? In reality, as soon as you're aware that it's going to be there more than 28 days, then it may well need an application. It will then come down to practical things about whether things are enforceable. I think the best example I saw of this was in a city centre location. In early November, a timber structure went up in the town square, which was going to be Santa's Grotto. Now, because Santa's Grotto opened in the middle of November and ran through till Christmas, it was technically going to be there for more than 28 days. But by the time processes and procedures had started to take any action about any deficiencies, the building would have been removed. So there has to be a degree of negotiation and talking to people about this. Right, ancillary buildings then, buildings that we're putting onto the site in connection with what's undergoing. So things like site huts, site cabins on a building site or a civil engineering site will be exempt as long as nobody's sleeping in them. I'm unfortunately old enough to remember the industry a few years ago where when we were really busy building houses, a lot of labourers actually slept in the site huts because it was cheaper than the local B&B. That would mean they're non-exempt. If you've got a building on a site that you're using as part of the sale of plots on a building site, then that is exempt, unless of course it's going to be the garage or double garage of a property that's going to be converted back afterwards. So those sort of buildings that are there as an ancillary use are exempt. It doesn't mean that the people designing them, positioning them, using them don't have to do their own sort of risk assessments to work out that things are going to be safe in terms of use. It just takes them out of the building regulation control framework. And then detached buildings under the building regulations, and this is where there's a clear difference between the definitions under planning for particular development and what we find in building regulations. So a detached building, single-storey building, less than 30 square metres, no sleeping accommodation, is exempt if it's constructed substantially of non-combustible material and it's a metre from the boundary. So the requirements there are really about fire spread between properties. There is a debate about what constitutes substantially non-combustible material. If you have a garage and it's got a timber roof on it, is that combustible or not? What you really have to look at is what's going to happen if something's on fire. So if next door is on fire and something lands on the roof of this property, is it going to set fire to it? So a lot of people will take the view that if it's a pitched roof with a slate or a clay or a concrete tile, they'll still consider that as substantially non-combustible, whereas perhaps a flat roof with a timber deck underneath isn't necessarily. But it's an interpretation issue. And 30 square metres is round about small double garage size. A detached building less than 15 square metres, there's none of those other restrictions, and that allows either a small single garage, but it would be very tight, or it will allow things like sheds and the like. And then buildings intended to shelter us from a nuclear or chemical weapon, that technically is exempt, but we have to show that that's actually what it's going to be used for. Okay. And the extension of building, what can we put on the back? This is perhaps the most contentious thing in terms of building regulations. We can extend a building by putting on a conservatory, a porch, covered yard, covered way, or a carport. There is a general limitation of 30 square meters. The difficulty within building regulations is that there is no definition of a carport. The definition that used to exist within the regulations, which talked about the roof and the walls being substantially translucent material, was removed from the regulations some while ago now, and as a result, theoretically, you can have a conservatory with a solid roof and solid walls, as long as it's thermally separated from the dwelling, so the existing dwelling maintains its thermal performance, its weather resistance at the line, so that if the conservatory was subsequently removed, then we would still have a building that is weather tight and performs thermally. There are some issues in terms of extending heating services into the conservatories, and there's a slight difference in the requirements between England and Wales as to whether a heating system can be provided that doesn't serve the property, or whether there's heating at all or not. So conservatories very much can be exempt, but to be honest, it's a conservatory, and I think the confusion that people have is over what these things are actually used for. If it's being used as a playroom, a dining room, a study, that's not a conservatory, and therefore requires permission as an extension. So there are a number of elements there that overlap, that have slightly different requirements. What you won't find particularly within building regulations is a lot of exemptions and in relation to commercial properties, whereas within permitted development there are some additional permitted development rights within the commercial sector, things like allowing solar panels on business premises. There's also a sort of two-tier approach to some of the permitted development where it is primarily permitted, but you still have to talk to the local authority in the first instance as part of these temporary arrangements. Okay, I'm going to try and pick up on, there's just another comment or two come through. The railway car park is for the function of the railway, therefore exempt building regs, yes or no? It will depend on how the system is set up, to be honest. There is no definitive answer, because it could well be that it's a totally separate money-making entity. It's not really part of the railway function. Having said that, an awful lot of car parks, particularly if it's, if it's a flat open car park, is not subject to building regulation control anyway. If it's a multi-storey car park, I could probably argue the case that it's not part of the function of the railway. But I think, to be honest, I'm not going to give, I can't give a definitive answer. It will need to be something that would be talked about with the local authority. But generally, I would say there's a case to say that the railway, the car park, isn't necessarily part of the railway function. There's some evidence here that people are finding that there's quite a bit of diverse opinion as to what constitutes a conservatory. And I would agree, since the definition has been removed, it has made it considerably more difficult to understand what constitutes conservatory, particularly as there are a number of companies out there now putting forward schemes for replacing conservatory roofs, the old sort of twin wall polycarbonate roof being replaced with something like a GRP panel that looks like roof tiles to make it a solid roof, including some insulation. I always tend to say to people, if you're saying it's an exempt conservatory, when you come to sell the property in 5 years' time and somebody questions, oh, have you got a copy of building regulation approval for that extension on the back? If you say, oh, it didn't need it because it's conservatory, then in your marketing material with your estate agent, it needs to be describing it as a conservatory rather than a usable living space. The concept of the conservatory is that in reality when it gets to the winter, we may not use it because it will be too cold. Not that we're going to put more energy into it that's then going to cause us a problem in terms of how the building performs. So I think it does go back to how is it used, how is it going to be described once we've decided that we can move away and say it's exempt. Right, somebody's querying a wooden shed within 1 metre from the boundary is not exempt. Just flicking back a slide there, as long as the shed is less than 15 square metres, it doesn't matter where you put it. It's only once it's over 15 square metres that it has to be a metre from the boundary. And then it's only exempt up to 30 square metres. So depending on the size of it, and most sheds will be less than 15 square metres, then there isn't an issue in terms of the boundary. Okay, right, are there any further questions this morning? Right. What's the logic for conservatories being exempt, somebody's just asked. I've got to be honest with you, it's a personal opinion. I don't believe there is any logic whatsoever. The original concept with a conservatory was that, as I say, it's a glass box on the back of the property that makes no difference whether it's there or not. Because we then have to look at things like safe breakage of glass, we have to look at the ability to escape a window on top of the conservatory. There are some issues with it. And certainly, as we're focusing a lot on energy performance of buildings nowadays, the concept of extending a heating system in does tend to mean why should be exempt. The reason the exemption is written the way it is in the building regulations is primarily if we clamp down on what people could do in terms of a conservatory being primarily glass, there's no difference in real terms in terms of what people build between a conservatory and a porch. And from the same slide you can actually see the exemption would allow you a 30 square metre porch under building regulations that may well be in solid construction with a cavity wall and a solid roof. So it does come back down to what is it being used for. So part of the reason the definition disappeared was because actually if you couldn't meet the criteria for what was considered a conservatory with the glazing, you just called it a very big porch. There is a slight difference of opinion in terms of how these things are heated and how that plays into the regulations and whether the exemption applies or not between England and Wales. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if at some stage it's reconsidered, but at the same time we have to consider how much does society want to restrict everything that we can do to our own property. So it is a balance. Okay, and yes, as one of our attendees has just pointed out, there is still a dictionary definition of a conservatory, which basically says for keeping plants, and very much that's the way I tend to talk to people. If it's somewhere to sit in the summer with a bit of bamboo or cane furniture, it's a conservatory. And does it require permission or not? Well, I think if it goes back again to what are you going to do when you come to sell the property? How are you going to describe it? Are you going to justify what looks to all intents and purposes like a rear extension as a conservatory, and as such are you marketing it? But the key feature has to be, have you still kept that thermal envelope, that weatherproof line between your existing accommodation and the conservatory? Now that might be French doors, it might be patio doors, it could be whatever. But as soon as those doors disappear, that's no longer a conservatory. And then somebody's quite rightly raised, one of these extensions, a conservatory or a permitted development under planning, might actually be then built over something like a sewer or in close proximity to a sewer, which requires an agreement with the Water Authority. That doesn't change the criteria for exemption. It would still be exemption, but the householder and the designer would still have to go through that build-over process. It doesn't tend to be focused so much when people are building porches and conservatories, because the implication is that if there were a major problem with the sewer in that situation, you would just take the structure down. But it is something as a designer you ought to be advising your client about and looking to see what we need to do. If a conservatory then becomes altered to become part of the conditioned space and the envelope, do we need to upgrade the walls to fire resistance if there's a boundary fire spread issue? Yes, basically if we look to change the conservatory into part of the dwelling, make it a formal extension, it will have to meet the requirements of the regulations in all of the regards, as would any material alteration. And could somebody technically say an extension under 30 square metres of the rear of the property is being used as a porch and get away with it under building control? What's the definition of a porch? You could argue you put a 30 square metre porch on. It would have to be over a door to the property. But again, it comes down to what are you actually using it for, and what are you going to sell it as? Because to be honest, if you've got a porch, it's there. You might store a few coats in it, your welly boots, but if you're using it as a room, it's not a porch. And let's face it, nobody really is going to build a 30 square metre porch. Okay. As you'll have gathered from some of the questions and some of the rather undefinitive answers that I've given, this is a bit of a minefield, and a lot of things, if you're not sure, it is worth checking with the planning authority or with the building control body. The issue with it is, with a lot of these things, the regulations are written by government, but when it comes to interpretation, it's down to the people who end up enforcing it to determine what's the correct interpretation in these areas. So certainly in terms of planning, talk to the local planning authority. In terms of the building regulation stuff, it's slightly different in that obviously we have private sector building control and local authority building control, but most private sector building control won't want to get too involved with exempt work because it's not controlled, there's no application, there's no associated fee. But it's worth talking to a building control body to get advice on these issues if you need to consider what interpretation might be. My main issue is always, what is it going to be? What would you market it as if you were going to sell the property? Okay, I don't think there are any other questions, so I'm going to hand back to you then, Katie, to wrap up.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you for your time this morning, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Some great questions there, some really interesting discussions, particularly about conservatories and about definitions, and as Kevin's saying, you know, the minefield that the interpretation leads to. As Kevin did mention at the beginning of this session, that this is the last webinar Wednesday for this academic year, but we will be back in September, and what we've done is we've already got a schedule from September right through to June of all of our webinars. You'll receive an email after this morning's session, and that will contain a link back to our website with all the information of the forthcoming webinars in it. And we've got subjects, for example, looking at radon and methane, we're looking at flood resistance and resilience, and then we've also got some webinars looking at event safety, for those of you who obviously are involved in those elements. So please feel free to join us on those, subscribe and just register as you would normally. And again, thank you very much. There's the opportunity to log your CPD with us. That's 1 hour CPD this morning. And just aware that our annual conference is in November. For those of you who are looking to attend who haven't actually booked yet, we're getting pretty busy. So if you are looking to come to our conference, I would definitely suggest getting your places booked as soon as possible. But again, thank you very much for joining us. Enjoy the summer, and we will see you in September. Thank you.